In March of 1960, Pastor Lawson was expelled from Vanderbilt because of his involvement with the desegregation movement. And then he and the Nashville student leaders were there and founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were at the founding conference held in April 1960. Their commitment to nonviolence and the Christian ideal of what Pastor Lawson called the redemptive community helped to shape SNCC's early direction. Pastor Lawson co-authored the Statement of Purpose adopted by the conference, which emphasized the religious and philosophical foundations of nonviolent direct action. Pastor Lawson was involved with SNCC from 1960 to 64, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference from 60 to 67, and for each organization he led workshops on nonviolent methods of protest, often in preparation for major campaigns. Pastor Lawson continued to work with various civil rights groups following King's assassination. In 1973, he became a board member of SCLC and served as president of the Los Angeles chapter from 1979 till 1993. He was also pastor of this church from 1994 to 1999. I am truly honored to introduce Pastor Lawson to you this afternoon. He is a hero of the civil rights movement and a leading voice for nonviolence in this world.
Well, I want to express my deep appreciation to the Black Jewish Alliance, to SCLC, to CLU, and to the other organizations that have gathered this group together this afternoon, and which also then invited me to be one of the keynote speakers. It's already been mentioned that we have these two speeches that are mimeographed, a letter from the Birmingham jail, and I want to reiterate it, and then the opening statement that Rabbi Heschel made in Chicago. I heard someone say this afternoon 64, but I thought it was 63 in Chicago. Could have been either way. But in any case, both of those two essays, speeches...
63 on the paper, you're right.
Beg pardon?
It's 1963 January.
Yeah, okay. That's what I remember. For people of faith, people who want justice, people who want truth, people who are committed to using their own lives in the incredibly important work of dismantling the old wrongs and creating the space so that we in Los Angeles and the United States and around the world, people can find space to create new understandings of who we are and what we are, and how we can best create an earth that is accessible to every newborn baby, no matter where they're born, and no matter what conditions under which they were born. So, those two essays are the two most important essays maybe out of the 20th century about this matter of what it means to be a person of faith and what it means to be a person of equality and liberty and justice for all. So I urge you to read them, to get copies of them if you do not have copies. The essay by Rabbi Heschel is in a book of his own editing called The Insecurity of Freedom. It's a beautiful little volume that he edited back in the 70s or 80s, I can't remember which. But it contains a number of the kinds of extraordinary teaching moments that he did across the years. I should say that I am a student of Rabbi Heschel, and I am a student and follower of Martin Luther King Jr. So, when this invitation came in, I didn't have anything to think about, but to say, yes, I'll do it, and wonder then what I was going to say. But in any case, I appreciate what Rabbi Brous has already said, and it summarizes, in a way, one of the startling statements by Abraham Joshua Heschel. namely when Heschel insists that the person who loves God cannot treat a human being like a horse. One of the startling, easy sentences that is there. You may or may not know that Rabbi Heschel was one of our great friends in our Southeastern movement that I tend to call, at that time, the Black Freedom Movement, or the Black Justice Movement. I do not call it the Civil Rights Movement. It was a part of what can be called the Civil Rights Movement of the United States, which began around 1866 with this first Civil Rights Bill out of Congress. That was a bill that said that all people born in these contiguous states and territories are citizens of the United States of America. I have a singular thesis this afternoon, and that is this, that if we want to follow and understand what it means to be a Jew or black, and a person of love and faith, no two figures can be more significant for our study and reading, and trying to grapple with the things they said and did. Rabbi Heschel joined the sixth campaign of nonviolence in what is better called the Black Freedom Movement, or the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King struggle for justice. Or as Congressman John Lewis of Atlanta has said, called it the nonviolent movement of the United States of America. And a lot of people don't want to call it that because that may mean that we have to do some serious examination of our own violence, of our own fears. And it might mean that we have to do a serious evaluation of having 800 military bases in more than 100 countries on every continent in our world today. Phenomenon, phenomenal, never before in the history of humankind, so far, much of the history that we know. A nation that claims to be a democratic society that has more than 800 military bases on every continent in more than 100 countries at this moment. That demonstrates our obsession with self-preservation. It does not reflect a realistic understanding of what we, the people of the USA, require to have a life of stability and security by any means. Now, white supremacy reached perhaps its greatest strength in the 40s and in the 50s. It had the strength of court decisions that year after year across 200 years sustained the status quo in various ways. That included slavery. That included the oppression and radical elimination of native peoples. That included the hanging of women as witches in Salem in 1637. That included understanding that people of color, the Jewish community, in large measure, in the beginning of the nation and to the present moment, were not included in the invitation to find equality and liberty and justice in the United States. And I want to indicate that in 46, one of the first shocks on white supremacy was the demand of black people in Los Angeles that the St. Louis Rams could not move to Los Angeles without desegregating. That's 1946. That was one of the first blows to the sensibility of white supremacy, white nationalism in our country. Then in 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers desegregated baseball with Jackie Robinson. The 46 desegregation was with Woody Strode from UCLA, great athlete, fine movie person, and with Kenny Washington, also a fantastic football runner from UCLA. Those were shocks to the systems of Jim Crow law and segregation and racism, the first blows. The opposition to those desegregations did not yet begin to form. But then with the declaration on the part of the Supreme Court of the United States, a 9-0 decision that racism and segregation in public education was unconstitutional. That is what primarily sowed the seeds for the resistances to truth that we have in the United States today that can be personified by the icon of untruth in the White House today. But I would warn us about that, because that icon may be the least of our worries. We perhaps need to be aware of the fact that he's but a little tip at the surface of the iceberg, that we have too many millions of our fellow USA citizens who dabble in that stuff, or who have drunk from the wine of that stuff in such a fashion that they really do not understand who they are themselves, and they do not understand who we, the people of the USA, some 300 and nearly 30 million people, who we are. And they clearly do not understand at all the historical documents out of which this democratic experiment began. But again, Heschel and King were both involved in that sixth campaign, which was the Selma to Montgomery March, that sixth major campaign of nonviolent direct action in the United States. And so what I propose quite briefly then to say to us, that if we are a gathering for the purpose of trying to promote the change in our city, in our state, in our country, in our world, then I want to propose to you that that nonviolent movement of the United States of America, quoting John Lewis, that must become our model. We must study those different campaigns. We must learn of the people who were there and help to make it happen from 1953 to 1973. And I would say to you that we must adopt as our fundamental spirituality soul force, nonviolence, soul force, spirit force, love force, truth force. All of these being words that Gandhi of India used as he experimented in South Africa and in India with how you bring about change. We've heard in this address from Rabbi Brous how love and compassion have to be at the heart of our spirituality. That's true, but there are various reasons why you and I must give up our playful game with various forms of violence, of speech and fist and ideological. Violence does not allow us to be citizens in a common world, a common place, common nation, common planet. Because violence is always geared to the notion that some people are not worthy of life and therefore should be treated any way we want to treat them because they're not worthy of life. They may have been in the same creation stream of human knowledge, but they are far less than worthy for whatever reason. And therefore they are folk who should be violently handled, violently treated. And we have to have a world of protection where organized war and organized violence are the heartspring and the anchor of our foreign and domestic policies. And if any of us in this room are serious about seeing our country move towards becoming a place where indeed justice does roll like mighty waters, then we'd better be prepared to get rid of our obsession and the propensity of Western civilization to think that every human situation has a military answer or a violent response. And so I simply propose to you that if we are a people gathered here who are genuinely concerned that every form of racism, every form of religious bigotry, every form of reducing human beings to a dot or to a jail cell or to abolition, then I push hard for the kind of spirituality and theology written by a Rabbi Heschel and the kind of theology and spirituality that was demonstrated by Martin Luther King Jr. with Rosa Parks and many others becoming the icon for, not the civil rights movement primarily, but for a religious movement, the black church movement, that was for breaking down the walls of hatred and lifting up the walls of truth. Breaking down the barriers of economic crudity and pain and injustice, and establishing a society where economic justice can roll like mighty waters. So there can be no seriousness, I maintain, in United States activism or in United States religions if they want to continue to cling to the obsessive violence of our time and to the organized violence of USA, which is a major barrier to the possibilities of a human race that lives up to its creator and its creation. So I commend to you soul force, love force, truth force, God force. So if you haven't considered it, you better begin to consider it, because the things in our nation today, from Trump throughout the various ways in which our nation has done wrong, if we're going to change it and move it and supplant it with a new earth or a new Los Angeles, that which has been created in each other, soul, mind, heart, spirit, joy, must become the tools that enable us to fight the good fight and to win the struggle for a different Los Angeles. I'm convinced that unless the United States of America has a massive nonviolent movement that outstrips anything that any of us did in the 20th century, the human race will not have the chance the Creator offers the race for life and equality.
Thank you. I have a few questions that I would love to ask of you, if that's okay. We have a few moments to discuss before we break up into our breakout groups this afternoon. And I've been wondering, actually, for the last several years, and I'm so glad we have the opportunity to sit in person so I can ask you this. I've been wondering, given all that you've seen and experienced over the years, if you see what's happening in America today as a last gasp of a dying ideology, or as a reflection of an ever-living, ever-present ideology that has no intention of going anywhere, but must actually be actively defeated and conquered if we are really to survive. Is this the last breath that we're seeing now?
I don't see that at all. As I said, it seems to me that the icon in the White House for the worst of what USA have lived as a people represents only the top of the iceberg. I think there are other figures in the United States that are far more shrewd than Donald Trump, will be far more charismatic, will have the language that deceives far better, and smarter about running this business. So there is a very, very strong chance that Trump could be the beginning of a series of ordeals for all of us in this country. And at the same time that that's going on, I do not see the political leadership that is offering us a more USA style, a more humanistic style, or a more style of nobility and justice. I don't see that political leadership. There are bits and pieces of it across the country in various people that I could name. But they are not in the position to be leaders of the changes the nation needs. I don't know if that makes sense. Huh? But so I think activist movements today have to be very much engaged in such a fashion that we raise up a different political sensibility for the nation. A different sense of courage for public life.
Can we talk a little bit about reparations today? Can I ask you about reparations?
Now, I don't see this as a place where I get asked questions and you go off scot-free.
I'm happy to tell you where I stand, but I think we're much more interested in hearing where you stand. Maybe I can frame it a little bit and then we can have a conversation about it. Would that be okay?
Sharon, answer your own first question.
Yes. What do you think about reparations?
Oh, okay. I'm happy to. Here, let me frame the reparations question, and then we can talk about it, because I think this is a really critical question for our day. So, there's an important machloket, or rabbinic dispute, that emerges in the Mishnah, which is the first code of Jewish law to be written 2,000 years ago. So here's the story that the rabbis tell. They say that a person builds a home, and at the very foundation of that home is a beam, a wooden beam, that he stole from his neighbor. Okay? He plants that beam, and he uses it as the foundation to build something magnificent. And some time goes by. The rabbis ask, what must he do in order to make this just? One rabbi says, you tear down the house and give back the beam.
Come on now.
That's Shammai. The other rabbi says, don't tear down a house, it's a beautiful house. But you must pay your neighbor not what that beam was worth when you stole it, but what it's worth now as the foundation for a beautiful home.
Amen.
So it seems to me, first of all, that neither of them is saying, you can't, what you can do is pretend that the beam's not stolen at all. Nobody says that that's okay, right? So given that our nation is built on stolen land by human beings stolen from Africa, what is the obligation today to make justice in the place of such profound injustice? And I will say that for the first time, we heard this question on the national debate stage just a couple of months ago, which I found to be extraordinary. And I'm curious what you and other veterans of the Black justice movement say about this. What does it mean to finally hear, after all of these years, that now entering into the mainstream is some kind of moral and political imperative, that something must be done to rectify the original sin of our country?
Well, in the first place, every struggle that we in the black community have lifted up in the last 75, 80 years has had certain demands for change, some of which started at the time. But where that was the case, we do not have an economic or political system in place that will take those beginnings and push them to their full weight across the society. For example, most people in this room do not know that one of the most wonderful things that happened in the 60s as a consequence of our movement was, out of Mississippi, the beginning of Head Start. Those essays have been written, those stories have been written out of the Freedom Sunday, as Freedom Summer, 1964. All right, so the Office of Anti-Poverty and President Johnson and others and academics put then together the notion of the Head Start program. But no, that's 65, 66. No Congress, no president has built the infrastructure for Head Start or spent the money to make it happen across the nation. The highest funding of it has been 60% of the need. It has always been used as a way to cut the federal budget and to balance the budget. So I'm saying to you that the movement to pull down the walls of injustice must itself become far more massive, because political structures since the 60s and economic structures to the 60s have done the same with Head Start. I mean, done the same with every potential change that they've done with Head Start. So how do we activists create the political parties, the political will, the work that must be done so that governors and legislators and others, and then Congress and the White House, all support the things that are already on the books that could radically create a different society? How do we do that? So, my own thesis is that reparations is essential, yes. Redo the harm to the extent that we can redo it, repent of it, change it, and rebuild it with justice. But all of that cannot happen in a blink of an eye. It's going to take generations, and how do we create the generations that will demand that the possibilities that are already inherent in our lives can be made the realities that they can be made? How do we do that? And I maintain that it's only going to be done by activist movement that works on the whole. I do not think, I mean, now I happen to know that my great-great-grandparents were slaves. I know this because my great-grandfather escaped from slavery as a very young man. And he carried with him his small son, who became the father, my grandfather. So in any case, how can I be repaid in my own present moment by the United States government or the USA people for the many years of slavery that my specific family lived? And I maintain that they can do it primarily, in my mind, by creating the economic, social, political programs that make it possible for today's children to grow up with real access. I personally am not interested fund of money being made available to my family, and all. I'm far more interested in the activism forging a different kind of society.
In all fairness, you know, the Black Jewish Justice, we believe in balance. We need you to ask the rabbi a question.
I have a really good final question then.
The final question.
Well, in one of my favorite speeches of Dr. King, he called The Death of Evil Upon the Seashore.
Yeah.
He speaks about a trip that he took with Coretta to India. And they were sitting out at the edge of a peninsula, and there's water all around them on almost all sides. And it's the most magnificent sunset that they've ever seen. And they're just sitting in awe of this sunset. And she said, she comments on how beautiful the world could be. And he says to her, is this not just the way that life is? Just as one light descends to the west, a new light is born on the east. And they look this way and see the moon rising. And he uses this as an argument that there's always new hope to be found, even in moments of incredible darkness, even with the sinking of a sun, there's the rising of a moon. And I want to ask where you see the new light emerging from the east, where the hope is for you in this hour.
Well, I think hope is lodged in this group.
Yeah.
And in people all around the world whose agendas are not the agendas of the power brokers, or the big banks, or the Pentagon, and the CIA, and so forth and so on. We have several million, billions of people on Earth. And if we had a way of telling the nation what nations and the power brokers, what our agendas, we would say our agenda is about how we cultivate ourselves, our children, our future, our health care, our communities. So activism has to dislodge the way in which decisions are being made in the United States and to get the power levers going that enable the agenda of the people to come to the foreground. And that is not easy to do, but I'm convinced there are signs that in the world this is happening.
Yeah.
Because in Western Europe for quite a bit of time, except as we in the USA have tried to convince them otherwise, you've had governments whose major budgets are in fact the welfare of the people. The health, the education, the shelter, the work, the arts and sciences of the people. That's why Western Europe has, over the last 30 or 40 years, created a quality life for a sizable percentage of the peoples of their countries that is so much far superior to what we in the United States have done. Our reporting of our country is mostly a lie. We have approximately, from all of my own study over 30 or 40 years, we have in the United States approximately 1/3 of our population for whom life is kind of miserable in many different respects. 1 out of 4 children in poverty live in a home where there's an adult working full-time, and sometimes more than one adult working full-time. The way in which big business has now redefined its workers so that they are not human beings but associates. And they don't know their schedule from week to week. And they get paid poorly all across the board. And while that happens, of course, then their labor becomes a faster channel for the people at the top to become billionaires. Mark Zuckerberg, for example. So I would say to you, you see, that this is the mark of our country. And one of the major roles of a movement locally and otherwise in this nation is to get the truth on the table so that more people in the United States will realize how much of a fake is the notion that we of the United States have been the heralders of freedom for the last 50 years. Not in my lifetime.